Howdy everybody. So today what we're going to have is a Photoshop tutorial on how to take a product that's shot on white paper. We're going to clip it out using the pen tool, and we're going to place it on a pure white background so it's suitable for web listings, Amazon, that kind of thing. And also we're going to use the natural shadow data from the original captured photo and project it onto that white background. That'll be towards the end. Yeah, so we can get started. Uh, Here's my desktop view. I am using Windows, the superior race of computers. Come at me. I apologize in advance if I get some of the translations to what you're supposed to do on Mac wrong. I believe Alt goes to Option and Control goes to Command, and Shift is the same. And I'll try and mention that throughout the video, but if I'm a little off on that, hopefully you can figure it out. Let's also set up my overhead camera so you can see what I'm doing on my mouse and keyboard. Just in case I'm using some of those modifier keys and whatnot, hopefully that'll be a little bit helpful. Okay, so let's get an idea of first what our goal is. So this is the image that we want to get out of this. So this is a pure white background. I have the info panel up right here, and you can see when I hover over the white, it's RGB 255 perfectly all the way. And that's because that is not from the photo, it's from a color layer set to pure white. So that's here. And this is what the original photo looked like. So this is the actual bracelet shot on the paper, pretty much straight out of camera. And so what we're essentially trying to do here is we are clipping it out, so it's just transparent like that, putting it on white, and then we're going to learn how to add the natural shadow data so it looks like that. Just a preview of what's to come. If you do the natural shadow data step properly, it should be able to project on pretty much anything. So here's like gray, here's a tan color, blue, or even something like this, like a marble countertop. And no matter what, it should look pretty convincing like it's actually sitting on there. You know, you can see the shadow highlights get darker right here next to the umbra of it, and it kind of lightens naturally because we're using the real shadow. That's the purpose of this. Yeah, okay, so let's minimize this down. I have this prepared. This is the original photo with just a couple of layers that I have here to demonstrate some things. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the pen tool. So how the pen tool works is, well, first of all, we have to find it here. It is this icon right here. I can kind of highlight that right here. You can also press P for pen tool. And just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to put this yellow color fill layer here, just using yellow because I know that the pen tool is going to look blue, so it'll be contrasting and you can see. So the basics of the pen tool is you're creating what are called paths. Paths are pretty basic. It's just a point here and a point here. That is a path. You can continue the path. You can kind of do whatever you want with it. You can make the path kind of overlap on itself, but that can get complicated later, but you can. And then at the end, you can reconnect the path like that. Although that part is not necessary. You can do things with the pen tool even if you don't reconnect like that. And the path itself doesn't really do anything. If you were to save this out, save it as a JPEG, there is no line there. It's like an imaginary path. And you can do a couple of different things with it, which we'll get to in a second, but just some of the anatomy here. This is the path itself. These dots are what's known as the anchor points. And additionally, if you make a new path, like here, and you hold down while you click and you drag, you'll get these anchor point handles. If you ever played like a basic game, like a pool game or like one of those tanks games where you kind of like click and drag and then you let go and then it makes the pool, the pool cue hit. It's kind of the same idea. You're picking a direction and a strength. And so say we pick this direction and strength. When we click the next dot here, instead of getting a straight line like we had here, what we have is the first dot kind of wants to push up in that direction and then smoothly go over to this dot. So if I press Control Z, which one of the really nice things about the path tool or the pen tool is you don't have to do it all in one shot. Unlike doing like a normal selection layer or something like that, where you kind of have to do it perfectly. And if you mess up, you kind of have to start over. You can modify these even later on after you save out and come back. You can always mess with the pen with paths. So that's one of their strengths. But so we have this anchor point tool or anchor point here with the handle. Now, if I click here and I hold again and I get more handles, what you can see is we have some movement here, and you're adjusting what the curve looks like. You can even invert it to kind of get an S curve like that. And the idea behind the pen tool is you can create curves that you otherwise probably wouldn't be able to do by hand unless you're like a master artist. And the idea is that this is kind of like a pen stroke that you're making. And then, so if I connect it right here, and you can see it gets kind of funky there because these two have these handles. One of the things you can do with this is if you right click it and you go to stroke path, here I have the brush that's going to do it. Whatever the last brush settings I had, it's going to draw along that path as though you had drawn it yourself. So the pen tool is often used for drawing and whatnot to get like perfectly shaped line art, essentially. Another thing that you can do is fill it with things. So this is fill here, foreground color. Now it's filled with pure white. And again, the path itself isn't anything. So we just filled this area, but the blue lines don't really matter. So also kind of like for drawing. But the big thing, and what we're going to be working on it for, is right click and you go to make selection. This stuff gets complicated. I might go over it, but if you just leave everything as it is, press OK, you get a perfect selection of whatever you pathed out. So in product photography, we use the pen tool to path out around the product and then use the selection tool to create a mask. That's how we get it onto white. That's how we get the product onto white. Now, the reasoning you would use the pen tool over just using a brush and a mask and just sort of like deleting the background by hand is if you kind of get in here, no matter how far you zoom in, this is a pretty perfectly smooth gradient. This is basically better than you could do it by hand. And the thing is when you're dealing with products, especially man-made products that are made out of metal or plastic, anything forged, die-casted, CNC machined, just most things in life, really, we have perfectly smooth edges. You think about this, you can think about like a toothbrush, you can think about an iPhone. Really, any man-made product has really, really smooth edges like this. So it lends itself well to using the pen tool. And just from experience, using the pen tool is the industry standard on how to clip out something like this. You could do it with the brush, but I'd highly encourage using the pen tool instead. And it's honestly not very much slower once you get used to it. And the advantages of it are pretty great. So a couple of more things about it. Let me actually just delete this. Let's go here, delete this as well, and deselect. Okay, so this is back where we were. So let's make one more. Let's try our best to kind of make like a circle. So if we hold here, and then we'll try. One thing that's good to do with the pen tool is to use as few anchor points as possible. The more anchor points you have, the more you have a chance to kind of screw up and make it look unnatural, really, because when you use Photoshop to like let it do its thing and make this curve perfect, you're better off. But sometimes it just doesn't work out that way. But let's try and make a circle. And it's just kind of like by hand. And so a couple of things. So this is not a perfect circle. I'm not going to be able to get it to a perfect circle, but I'm going to show you how you can like adjust things once they're already there. So if you press the control key while you're in the pen tool, it turns into this little white selection arrow. This is called a direct selection tool. From here, you can click on any one of your anchor points and it will show you your handles. So even after the fact that you've done this, you can mess with your handles like this. And once you're doing it this way, unlike when you're first making it with the pen tool, you can mess with one handle more than the other. You can even make it go like all the way flat like this while the other one's still doing its thing. And so you can use that for adjustments. You can also hold down the control key and click and drag this also to adjust what you've done. And another thing that you can do is once you've gotten this selected here, if you hold the Alt key instead and you go to one of these anchor points, you get this little caret symbol instead. I'm actually not sure what this tool is called. I always call it the caret symbol, but it's probably something else. But hold down the Alt key, and the difference here is when you click and drag this handle, it will actually break its relationship to the other side. So you can use this to make really dramatic shapes and whatnot. And we'll kind of get to later why you might be using that when you're pathing out a product. And then additionally, what you can do, I'm going to Control Z to go back on that. And this is probably like the biggest critical key is as you're using the pen tool, the fastest way to go is, again, kind of using like the fewest amount of these anchor points as possible. But as you do that, you're going to make mistakes along the way. But one of the quickest way you can rectify those mistakes is no option or alt or anything needed here. If you just click in the middle of this, you'll notice it will add an extra anchor point. And not only did it add an extra anchor point, it adjusted these two anchor points as well as created some handles on this to keep your same curve mathematics, basically. But now you have 3 anchor points instead of 1. And so what you can do is click here, press the Control key, and you can adjust that curve on the fly really, really easily. And again, I'll show you how that works once we're doing the actual product. But learning that, when someone kind of taught me how to do that, they told me one day that if you're not doing this, you're not using the pen tool properly. I was kind of offended at the time, but now I get it. And that is actually vitally important for you to do things properly and quickly. And let me see. The only other thing that I would mention from here, you'll use this less often, but say you have something more boxy like this again. Remember the Alt key, so that's the Option key on Mac. Sorry, once again, Alt is Option on Mac and Control is Command on Mac. If you use the Alt key on here and then click and drag, you can basically force a anchor point that has no handles to have handles. So if you like accidentally created one that didn't have handles but you meant for it to be a curve, you can just use the Control key and do this instead. Okay, now let's talk about where the paths are saved. You might have seen me doing this action over here. Let me explain that a bit now. We just delete it for now. So when you create a path, something like this, it automatically saves as something called a work path. You can see that it's italicized here. It's italicized because it hasn't actually saved properly to the document. And you save it by double-clicking it, naming it something, and press OK. Now that is saved. Now I can click off of it and create a new one. Oh, there we go. And here I have another work path. Double-click it, path 2, and we have that saved. And you can see right here it has like a tiny, tiny illustration of what you've created. That white space in there would be where it would fill with color or select if you use the selection tool instead. And you can actually end up doing more complicated things. So say you do this, and then you make something inside of it. Photoshop should naturally, whoa, that got weird. Photoshop should naturally kind of like see that none of these intersect, and what you meant is to create something regarding this area here, all under one work path. We can double click it, save it, and if we create a selection from there, you'll see it will select it will select what's here and then minus what was inside of it automatically. You can get into the weeds a little bit like with this as well, because up here, I can highlight this for you. These are the actual like parameters for how to do this. Auto add and delete is kind of like how these paths are merged together, as well as this thing here. Exclude overlapping shapes. But if you just don't touch these things, it will work how you would logically want it to. So I would say in the beginning, just don't touch these, leave them as they are, and it will work somewhat how I'm describing. So as you can see here with this one called bracelet, I've already cheated and I have the path for the actual bracelet that we're going to get to, but we're not going to use that yet. So we're going to start a new path. I'm just going to use that to kind of cheat time and skip ahead a little bit as we start working on this. So you have to pick a point. It's just kind of random, whatever you feel like. I'm going to go down here. One extra thing to kind of keep in mind and something you can do to help is if you press and hold the R key, that's the rotate tool. You can also find that right over here. This is the rotate tool. You hold down R. If you hold down and you click and drag, it will rotate your canvas. But unlike when you're in the crop tool or something like that, you're not actually rotating anything, you're rotating your view of it. So if you imagine having like a piece of paper on the table here, you're just rotating it around so you can more properly work on it, draw on it, whatever you want to do. But you can see over here on the navigator that your image itself has not actually moved. It's still the same. You haven't actually rotated anything. This is just to help you work better. I like doing this because I like using the natural flow of the mouse to try kind of just like make these shapes. And so I like working so that I can kind of go left to right like this. So I rotate it so that it looks proper to me. But it's an optional step, but it can help. So for the pen tool, we're going to want to go nice and close in. What I like doing is even for corners like this, what you might be tempted to do is do like a perfect, V like that. But that's not really that realistic. What I found is better is to start in a corner like this and do some really, really baby handles like this. They won't affect much, but they'll do something. And if you want to adjust it later, it makes it easier. So I'll kind of start with something like that and then put the next plot here. And as far as like where you angle it and how much you use on the strength for the handles, kind of just comes from experience. But one thing I would say is, I end up using a lot of mathematical terms. I apologize, but you kind of want these handles to be tangent to your object that you're trying to path out. So you kind of don't want to bring this into here or vice versa, because even if it makes one side look good, the other side will end up looking bad. So kind of leave them tangent, and then again from the strength, you just kind of have to start doing it, and you'll get better at it. You got to go here. Take that as best as you can, and then what we can do is we come back and we see these little kind of like errors, like this wasn't quite right. What we can do is put a dot here and then a dot here and grab this with the control key or command on Mac and bring it in. And now we've kind of modified that little path layer, or that path right there, to go along where it should have. Same thing here. Click right here, control key, bring it up, and now we've fixed it. And so if you kind of get into a rhythm of doing that, so here I'll go like straight to this spot, and then straight to this spot, and like here, and here. I know that I can then come in here, click here, control key, bring it out, bring these out a tad bit, make it look consistent. Same deal here, bring that out. Oops, here, control key, bring that out. This is probably just fine. At a certain point, if you're getting this close and trying to like mess with stuff like that, once you make the selection, it's really not going to matter. But if we wanted to be really, really careful with it, we could just add another one and kind of adjust that as well. And then from here, we can go probably like all the way to here. And maybe to here. And again, you notice that I'm kind of like skipping a lot of area. This is where you'll end up developing some speed with this. And then you can kind of, once again, kind of go back and fix your mistakes. So here, if I add an anchor point, bring this down, that then looks good. Same here. I think with this one, I'm going to select this anchor point. I'm going to make this a little bit wider. Then I'm going to add one of these and bring it up. Same here. here and bring it up. Oops, my bad. Widen this a little bit. Now, I just made a little bit of a mistake. So I clicked off with the pen tool. You probably noticed for a half second the path completely went away. It'll never actually go away. You can always go back to your path section right here, which is next to your layers section. I don't know if I mentioned that. And you still have your work path. But when you click away, you're no longer working on extending that path by default. So to make it continue, you have to click the edge where you want to continue it from, and you get this pen tool with this kind of like this little symbol next to it where I've never really known what it looks like. It kind of looks like a little square with like a dash through it. Click that, and now you're back in business. Because if I hadn't done that and I clicked like here, oh, I'm sorry, before I had clicked this and started the continuation process, if I clicked here, it would actually start a new path, which is like not what we wanted. So if you ever deselect your path, you just click this to start it up again, and then you're good to go. So once again, let's see right here is like a little bit of one of these, maybe one of these, and maybe from here. And once again, just kind of going back, clicking, holding control or command, adjusting, same deal, control or command to adjust. And remember the initial click to make one of those inside of the path is just a regular pen tool click, no command, and then you use command to grab the anchor point and drag it around. And then so we can just kind of continue going. Pretty big strokes. Again, this is kind of like how you'll build speed from this, because I guess once I get to here, over the next section, let me show you kind of like the wrong way, but this is probably going to be the way that you would naturally do it at first when you're starting out, but it can lead to a lot of mistakes, and it's definitely slower. Let me finish this up real quick. Not making this perfect, but that's okay. Okay, and then we're here and here. Okay, so what you would naturally want to do is kind of like with every single one of these little twists and turns, you're going to want to make your own anchor point and kind of like adjust as you go. So you'd make more like this and this kind of thing. And to be honest with you, like this can work out, but there's two things. First of all, it is definitely slower. Once you get faster at the other way, it's definitely more efficient in general, especially with more complicated shapes. And then the other problem too is when you do get into problems like this where you've made like a slight mistake, adjusting it can be a little bit more tedious, especially if you're avoiding using the control key and you're wanting to do this basically like live. You can kind of do this, and at a certain point, you kind of have to start like extending it in like an unnatural way to make it work. But then maybe extending it that far was bad for over here, and then you end up with just situations where your path can not only start looking unnatural, like has more deviations to it than it should, and not just having like a nice perfectly straight line. But then, like I said, it's also just kind of like a little bit less efficient. So it's good to kind of know how to do both. I can kind of guarantee you, if you've never done this before and you first start out, this is how you're going to initially want to do it, not add in all the control and alt and all that other nonsense. But be open to it and practice with it. Try out adding these extra anchor points and dragging them around, because it can really increase your speed significantly with these, and accuracy as well. Okay, so I would say that's about as much as I want to talk about it. By the way, so with the whole rotation tool, I wasn't really doing it, but I could continue rotating this as I go around. I probably should have been, so that I could be continuing to do it along the left and right path like I prefer. But once you're done and you want to have it go back, if you press the R key or press the rotate tool over here, and let me highlight it again. Up here, this is when you're in the rotate tool selection. Up here where you have your toolbar, if you press reset view, that's going to bring you back to just straight up and down. So once you're using the rotate tool, it's kind of like impossible to get back to this point naturally, but that's how you do it. You just press R and you press reset view and you're back. And again, with the rotate tool, nothing was actually happening. Even if you saved your document where it's completely rotated around, when you open it up again, it'll be like you had done nothing. So it's all just sort of like imaginary, and you're just kind of rotating your piece of paper along your table to just give a better view of it, but it's not actually changing the design or anything like that. Okay, so over here in the path selection, I have my work path. I guess I'll just save this just in case we need to come back to it. We're going to click away from that, and we're going to use bracelet instead. And so you can see I already did this pretty well everywhere. So a couple of notes. So first of all, you want to be pretty accurate with this as best you can. I chose to do things like this where we have kind of like a an unnatural chunk of metal right there. I can tell this is obviously like a manufacturer's defect and not supposed to be like that. I just ignored it and pathed over it to kind of make the product look better. But if you do that too much, if you're not sticking to where the bracelet actually is as best you can, in general, if you were just putting this on white, just a white backdrop, it wouldn't really matter. But with us doing the natural shadow layer, it's kind of necessary for you to do a really, really good job with making your path, your pen tool, pathing go right along where the product goes. So try and keep an eye on that. And so once again, if you come here to the path tool, well, actually, I hadn't shown you this, so not once again. So again, if we press P for pen, if you right-click anywhere on the path tool, on the path, you get this menu here. But also over here in the path tool, even if you're like on the brush tool or anything like that, if you select a path and right-click it, you get a smaller menu with a lot of similar things. And we are going to do make selection. Just leave all of these as is for now. You can learn the more nuances of those later. And note how it made a selection. And once again, I had made these subpath tools within my main path, and it knew to cut those out of the actual design. So we have this like outer path, inner path, as well as little holes cut out, and it's all just one thing called bracelet. So it does a pretty good job of doing all of that automatically and naturally. Only thing that I would say is if your pen paths ever intersect with each other, it can make this get kind of funky. But usually they're not intersecting because products don't work like that, but just watch out for it. So for now, that's kind of all we needed the path to the path and the pen tool for. So we're going to go back to just our layers. I'll get rid of these because they were just for the demonstration purposes. And here we have just the product on the white paper. And then we're going to hit the mask tool down here, or the mask button, to create a mask out of the selection that we made. That's going to make this go on transparent. And then to get the pure white background, there's a few ways to do this. I would say the best way is to click here and do a solid color and then just make it white. You could also make it whatever color you want, but what we want is white. And then this went on top of my photograph, so we're just going to drag it below. And for a lot of intents and purposes, this would be done. A lot of Amazon photography, website photography, listing photography ends up just being on white like this. So this might be far enough. But like I said, we're going to use the natural shadow data from the original shot and bring it back onto this. Now, if we go back to the original shot, if you hold shift and click on the mask, you can make it go away for a moment, but you don't actually delete it. So with the original shot, if we kind of switch back and forth here, you can see there's a pretty dramatic difference between pure white, and what that white paper actually was. But you can also see here that there's a shadow being cast on the paper. Here, really everywhere. It's kind of dramatic down here as well. And we need to figure out a way to get that shadow and isolate it on its own layer so we can use it on different layers. So how are we going to do that? So first of all, if you press shift and click on this again, you can make that go on and off. So that's how I did that. Click on your photo layer. We're going to do Control J, that's Command J on Mac, that's to duplicate it. This bottom one here, that's the one we're going to end up using for the shadow. These next couple of parts you don't necessarily have to do when you're doing this in the future. You can kind of skip this, but I'm going to do it for like demonstration purposes here. So I'm going to turn off the top layer. Doesn't make any difference for now because, it's just like the same thing duplicated. And I'm going to turn this off. But on top, we have our original product still cut out. So underneath, we have this here. And what we're going to do is use one of the layer tools, and we're going to use the one called multiply. Now, when you first put on multiply, as it stands right here, it's basically going to do nothing. But what multiply does is it's a blend mode, and it makes it so that that layer, if something is completely white, like 255, 255, 255, it won't do anything below. It'll basically just be like transparent. And the lower from white it is, the lower the luminosity as you go down to like 50% gray and all the way down to blacks or other colors as well, they're going to start showing more and more. And so what we want to do is figure out a way to make all of this white paper here pure white. And along the way, we're going to lighten this shadow some, but I'll show you how to deal with that. But in order to do that, we essentially have to increase contrast, and we're going to do that using one of these adjustment layers, and we're going to use levels. And so this is your levels properties right here. If you haven't used it much, this is basically a histogram showing all of the pixels in your photo. This will end up looking a lot different if you're not shooting on white, but there's a lot of white pixels in this photo, so you have a lot of this graph showing up here in white. And if you click and drag this handle right here and bring it in, note that it starts brightening your image. Now, it's not just brightening, though. What it's doing is it's changing what is the highest brightness in your photograph. So by bringing it in more and more, eventually you're going to match the tone of your paper. And in doing so, you're going to make your paper essentially go to pure white. Now, you can do this by eye, but it's much, much better to use one of the built-in Photoshop tools. If you hold the Alt key or Option key as you do this, note it does this really, really dramatic effect on your paper or on your image. What this is essentially showing you is a much more dramatic representation of the luminosity values, like how bright everything is on your image. And what you want to do is bring this into the point where most of your paper is going pure white like this, and your shadow gets dark enough, like right around here, to where it like disconnects properly from the edges of your photograph. I guess let me let go and kind of give you an idea. So essentially what we have here is all along here is now perfectly white based on that graph we were just looking at. And then here, it's going pretty much pure white towards these edges, and then it's gradating into shadow. Okay? Now, if we bring back our original photograph, you can see here that, once again, if we look at our info layer here, what we have is 255, 255, 255 on the RGB. So this is pure white, but we still have our shadow showing up. Now, we're not quite done. There's a few more tweaks we can do. Now, note, the shadow is showing through, but also anything that was a little bit darker on that shadow layer is also showing through. So notice like this little sensor dust that we had here, smudges on the lens, something like that are going to show up. So I'll kind of show you how to deal with that later, but just be aware. But the main thing is that the shadow data is starting to show up. So if we come back here and we look at the levels layer again. Now, first of all, what we want to do is we don't want this levels to be affecting anything but your shadow. So we're going to right click it and we're going to create a clipping mask, and it's going to put this little arrow right here. Let me highlight that here. This shows that it's a clipping mask. If you've never used one of these before, that simply just means that this levels tool, this levels layer, is only affecting this layer and nothing else. So yeah, clipping mask. And then if we go back to the levels, and once again, before we were using this little handle. Now, if we use this handle, our white point, our perfectly white point is not going to change. So it's not going to change that work that we did of like making the outside of it pure white, but we can actually darken what's left. So we can take this and kind of slide it around and just give our shadow a little bit more oomph. So maybe something like around there. This is just going to be like personal taste, but I think that's looking pretty good. But in doing so, you're probably noticing that it's kind of starting to look like weird and cruddy because it's got this weird color cast to it. If you go back to your original image, that color cast is there. It's basically just the light reflecting off the gold, and so this shadow is not really just like monochromatic. It is colored. It's gold. But on here, it looks natural. Once we're doing this step to it, it starts looking kind of like unnatural. So if we click our shadow layer again, adjustment layer, and do hue saturation, we're going to desaturate this shadow layer to make it go almost to pure gray. So that's this slider right here. Drag it down. I've found that if you go all the way to pure gray, this starts looking also weird in its own way. So we want it to have like a little bit of color. I've noticed about like 80 looks good. But again, this is just kind of like personal preference. But as you just kind of go along here, you can kind of like get an idea of what you prefer. So yeah, I'll stick with, I guess, like 75. So this is already looking pretty good. Now, if you come in here and you look at your shadow, note how it looks pretty grainy. This process is very like harsh and kind of like destructive on your image. And all of this grain is happening because what this levels layer is doing to this shadow is like very, very unnatural. And it's kind of like you've like overcooked it. You've probably heard of like overcooking photos where you're just kind of like over editing them. We are totally over editing this, and that's where this grain is coming from. We're just going to deal with that in a different way. So select your shadow layer once again. We're going to go up to filter, and we're going to go to blur, and we're going to go to surface blur. What surface blur does is it's kind of like a Gaussian blur or any other blur that you've probably used, except what surface blur specifically does is on that image, on whatever it is that you're blurring, whenever it sees a hard edge like this, it will not blur it. So it will blur things with like outside of this hard edge, but it won't actually make this hard edge start to look fuzzy and kind of like bring into here. So essentially what we're doing is we are blurring the shadow, but we're not bringing any of that jewelry back into the shadow, which would end up looking bad. You can mess with the radius and the threshold. I kind of have mine set up to do this, so these are like the levels that I usually work at, but if you drag these back and forth, I can even just kind of show you. It's just going to change the look of what your shadow's looking like, and then same with the threshold. I think I had this at 11. It just changes the look of everything. But like I said, 11 and 9 for me work well for this, but again, this is kind of personal taste. Hit OK, and now we have a much more smooth looking shadow. Now, one last thing we want to do here is we want to modify the mask of this shadow. So once again, we have like some stuff happening here, like this little notch from where I kind of like improperly did the pen tool to make the product look better. That looks bad. So does this over here. So does this smudge. So what we're going to do is on our shadow layer, we're going to just delete this layer mask completely. That didn't really do anything because it wasn't even showing. But now we're going to put a mask back on this layer. We're going to hold down Alt or Option on Mac, click it, and then that gives us a fully black mask on our shadow. Completely disappears, and we're going to paint it back on kind of only where we want it to be. So we're going to get our brush. I'm going to go to white so we can paint it back on, as that's how the masks work, and just going to brush the shadow back in. And you don't have to be super precise with this, but the more precise you are, the more of that extra junk you're going to leave out of your photograph. So it pays to do this at least somewhat well, but you don't have to worry about it too much. Okay. And that's looking pretty good. And as you can see, I got rid of that smudge that was up here. I got rid of this little notch that was showing. And I actually still have this showing here, so I'm just going to make my brush much, much smaller, hit X to change to the black color, and I'm just going to kind of selectively get rid of that. And that is pretty much it. We have our product pathed out pretty perfectly with the pen tool, and then we have the natural shadow data projecting onto our new white layer. And then once again, just as kind of like a check to make sure that this is working well, if you double click on your white layer and change the color, if you project this onto different colors, that shadow should remain looking good for most anything. Now, what I've noticed with this, if you ever start using this for like compositing or doing something for like say like Instagram or something like that, where you actually want to use colors and maybe you want to make it look festive, something for summer, for something for Easter, or something like that. If you shoot on white paper, that is going to do well on all colors from about middle gray up to white. So this is still like a relatively light color, so it still looks fine. When you start getting into much deeper colors like this, it works better if you had shot this instead of onto white paper, onto gray paper, because it needs that like extra shadow oomph, I guess, as I said before, to make it look more natural. Because this starts to look more like it's like floating above this color, whereas when it's lighter, it looks like it's really like resting on it. I'm not quite sure if that makes sense, but yeah, since we did this properly, we can pretty much pick any of these colors, and it ends up looking natural on all of them because the shadow is no longer a part of the original layer, but is now separated onto its own layer, and we can project it on anything. And again, even if you put a photo back here, it would work as well. So that is pretty much it. Final note is just, once again, after you've done this pathing step to get your bracelet perfectly made, it's just good practice to name all of your paths. Don't leave it as a work path. You might end up needing this later. Say you have some kind of revision come back, and your art director or something wants you to like recolor this bracelet or really anything. This path that you worked so hard on might actually come in handy for doing something like that, for making a new reselection and whatnot. And you might lose your work if you leave it as one of those italicized work layers. So just double click it, name it something, or even just leave it the default. But then when you do that and you save out this as a layered TIFF file or a PSD file, all of your pathing work will stay in there forever, and you can come back to it whenever you want. And so, yeah, I think that about does it for this tutorial. Please reach out to me if you have any questions, and hope you have a good day.